Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Sea Ice Survival, the Winter World of Polar Bears, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Eleanor Edye. Eleanor earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Winnipeg with a dual major in biology and physical geography. She pursued graduate studies at the University of Alberta, researching tree-line dynamics in the Churchill region, which sparked her specialization in tundra ecosystems and bryology. Eleanor now works extensively in northern and prairie habitats as a NatHab expedition leader, combining her expertise in plant biology with her passion for Arctic and subarctic environments to guide travelers through these unique ecosystems. Eleanor, welcome back. It's good to see you again. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Rob, and hi to everybody joining live today or watching this later on. Thanks for joining, and thanks for joining especially because we are going to spend the next hour talking not just about polar bears, but about polar bear habitat and what the heck polar bears do in the winter. So as Rob said, I'm one of our expedition leaders here with Natural Habitat. I work on our Churchill programs, which includes our polar bear trips, as well as our Northern Lights trips, and that season is just about to start, and Churchill Summer, which is primarily belugas, but sometimes features polar bears making an appearance as well. And I also do some work in Iceland. So this picture that I've got up here was taken this last polar bear season at NatHab up in Churchill. So we run our polar bear tours with Natural Habitat in October and November out of Churchill, Manitoba, Canada, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump on a couple of days on the train away from where I am at home now. Churchill is not the only place, or nor is October and November the only time that you can see polar bears around the world, but Churchill in the fall is one of the best times to see polar bears on land relatively close, and usually with the naked eye. So for those who have joined to see us, to see polar bears with us in person in October and November, you'll already know a little bit of what I'm saying, or possibly a lot of what I'm saying, but October and November is really when those bears congregate at the shores of Hudson Bay, waiting for the sea ice to form so they can move out onto the ice and spend the winter and spring months on the ice. For those traveling in October, it can be relatively warm or starting to get into colder time, and November is usually relatively cold as that ice really starts to form up. Now, when we're watching these bears in October and November, it's always really, we always really have to reprogram what we're seeing a little bit, because this picture that I took, and I had a big camera on a stick, which is why it kind of looks like a drone, took this picture here. You can see that there is a mom and a cub walking beside a polar rover, which is the vehicles we use to go out and see the bears with. They've got this lovely back deck that you can step out on and be in the open air, and this pair of bears chose to walk right past us. Now, when I look at those bears, and we'll talk about like bear fatness a little bit, they look pretty good. They're not skinny. That cub who's in front especially, it's got a nice plump rump, which tells you that he or she has been feeding really well. But as we kind of keep repeating when we're on trip, these are bears who are not really living in their preferred habitat at that time of year. They are there waiting for the ice. They are waiting, they are generally fasting, they are often resting to conserve energy. And it's really hard, I think, for us as humans who live a very, very different life to imagine that like the bounty of land is not what is there for the polar bears. They do not really engage with the bounty of land, and it's not really accessible or helpful to them. They are there waiting to go out on the ice. And if you know and love bears, you might think about, oh, hibernation in the winter. So that's a common misconception, thinking that polar bears might also hibernate in the winter, or maybe they're going out on the ice to build a snowbed and hibernate there. Sometimes people think that maybe bears are eating on land and fasting on the ice, and usually it's the opposite. So this really seemed like a great opportunity to take this webinar to highlight what a polar bear preferred habitat is, how that habitat differs around different populations of bears, and how these bears are so well adapted to a life on the ice. Because when we see them on land, we're just really seeing a little smidgen of their life, and it's not always the part of life that they're super stoked about, right? This is when they're waiting for the good part to start. Okay, so this next slide here is just taking a step back and looking at where we can find polar bears. So polar bears, you think north, that's pretty well where we're talking about for polar bear habitats. This is a view of our continents looking from the North Pole downwards, with North America on the left and Eurasia on the right. We find bears around 5 different nations. So the US has bears in Alaska. Canada has a large portion of the world's population of polar bears. There's also bears in Denmark, as represented by Greenland, Norway, and Russia. There's a big range of global population estimates, and it ranges from about 21 to 35,000. That's the most recent estimate from WWF. We often use the number like 25,000 just to pick a single number to work with when we're talking, but that is very much an estimate. And for most of these populations, they have to be estimates because these are very, very inaccessible locations for humans to get to. When you look at this picture of where their habitat is, you can see that it does include a lot of coastal areas, and like certainly this is a big green blob placed over here, but it's also relatively accurate where we see the habitat being both the sea ice around the North Pole and the Arctic Basin, and then through the Canadian Arctic archipelago and north of Alaska and north of Russia. But it also includes the land surrounding those areas too. So I wanted to talk about where they're living, which helps us understand how they're making a living. So ice, land, it's all polar bear habitat. It's all within the purview of a polar bear, whether you're a polar bear chilling on the ice or a polar bear chilling on land in the summer. And just to emphasize again, it's often really challenging for us to understand that a polar bear prefers the habitat pictured on the left here as opposed to what's pictured on the right. That looks nice to us. As humans, we have a bear who's sleeping. She's got a couple of cubs sleeping around her. I took this picture this point many summers ago, and it was a mom with a couple of yearling cubs who just wandered in, plunked themselves down, had a little nurse, and then had a little nap. And still, that is not how they want to live. Given the choice, they're going to be what we see on the left-hand side. And for us, when we're watching bears, when we're thinking about bears, where we see them is going to be what we see on the right. So the images you see and the way we see bears portrayed, or if you come visit the bears, that's generally what we're picking up on because that's where our lives cross paths. But it's not how they spend the majority of their time. So with those different populations around the world, we recognize 20 different subpopulations, of which about 2/3 of them are within Canada. When we're talking about populations, these are like management units. They're defined by these geographically distinct groups. There is genetic movement between the different populations, but we divide them up into these management units based on things like sea ice patterns, how much genetic flow there is between populations, how much bears move between the areas. You can look at these hard lines on a map, but also understand that they are very fuzzy borders, right? There's bears that cross these lines all the time. But it just, humans like tidy boxes, I like tidy boxes, and this helps us make management decisions for individual bears and these bear populations. So here we can see again, we're looking from the North Pole downwards, and these different populations, and you can see North America here on the bottom left. This is a recent WWF map showing subpopulation trends in 2024 and the relative size of each population. Now, as I mentioned, many of these populations are not well studied because they are nearly inaccessible. The populations that you see with unfilled circles, we do not have any estimates on those population sizes. We just don't know. It's too hard to get to, the money isn't there, it's logistically challenging. For whatever combination of reasons, we just don't have that data. But for a lot of the Canadian populations and the Alaskan populations as well, you can see that we actually have population estimates for those. And especially for the more southern populations, like the Western Hudson Bay polar bears and the Southern Hudson Bay polar bears, we actually know a lot about those populations, and they have been studied for over 50 years at this point. So just for reference, the population that we go visit on NatHab trips is the Western Hudson Bay population. You can see my arrow here, just this red, bottom left red box there. So let's talk about this ice and these populations, because I really want to stretch our mind a little bit, and I certainly will be talking about their adaptations to the ice and like how they make a living. But it's just, I keep saying this, but it's so hard for us to understand this very different habitat. It's like us trying to picture what it's like to live on the seafloor. We just don't have the context for it. So ice is not the same everywhere, and every bear that's in a different population is going to encounter a different world on the ice. This map here was made by researcher Stephen Armstrong. He's the chief scientist of Polar Bears International, and he's done a lot of great work on the different types of ice habitats in the polar basin. And in this map here, the blue lines demarcate those same polar bear populations. You can see I put a little yellow star where Churchill is. So that's the Western Hudson Bay population of polar bears. The Southern Hudson Bay population of polar bears is right beside them. And then we have all the other 20 populations around there as well. And then that middle one with the whites, the A beta, is the Arctic Basin population. So all of these populations are working on ice for at least some part of the year, and that ice is going to be different. And each of these populations is going to encounter different challenges, different ice conditions, and a different way of living. So a bear in the Western Hudson Bay population is not going to have the same life on the ice, specifically as a bear who might be in like the Kane Basin population or Eastern Greenland, because the way the ice moves and the way the ice forms is different. And you can, as I say that, I hear myself like, yeah, the ice forms by freezing. That happens the same way, but ice is very dynamic and there are changes between these populations. So green first is our seasonal ice. Our yellow is our Arctic archipelago ice. Our blue is our convergent ice. Purple is our divergent ice zone. I'm going to talk about these a little bit more. And then the uncolored bit in the middle is the Arctic Basin, is the multi-year sea ice. One other thing that I really want to call out here is if you long outside both the archipelago islands and then north of Russia here, this is the, it's labeled here on the map as the 300-meter depth contour. So it's underwater at which the land drops off beyond the 300 meter, around 900 feet. This really marks the edge of the continental shelf, and closer to land from that little pink line is really our most productive areas. So if you've ever gone like offshore fishing, or if you seafood comes from, most of the fish and most of our the ocean productive areas around the continental shelf. So this really shows us where good habitat is and where, you know, lots of fish and lots of things to eat are going to be. So all that is to say, Arctic Basin here, that and the continental shelf really encompasses all their habitats. So this is just another kind of picture here of the ice, just to show you again the difference between the multi-year ice and the annual ice. So this was just the state of the world in 2012 during ice maximum. So this big white blob in the middle marks the extent of the multi-year ice. So this is ice that does not melt in the summer, and it's usually quite thick. So it's multi-year ice. And all of the ice around it is our annual sea ice. So it forms at some point in the fall, and it breaks up at some point in the spring. But that's where our like different locations of seasonal ice and convergent and divergent differ. So the seasonal sea ice, this is the whole green area, which includes our where our Churchill polar bears are. It is what it sounds like. It's seasonal. It forms and then it deforms. This is an area marked by a lot of shallow continental shelf area, like all of Hudson Bay, all through the offshore areas here. Very, very productive areas, high amounts of fish, high amounts of seals. Because this area is so productive and it makes all this food product, the bears that live in this green area here are able to feast when the ice is in place, and then they must fast when the ice is not in place. Of all the bears around the world, these are the populations that we know the most about. This is not just because they're most southern and the easiest to access. That's certainly part of it, but the rest of it is that these are the populations of bears that spend a significant amount of their life on land. Bears are easier to get to when they are on land, but the ice here is very different than the ice in the rest of the polar bear range. So it forms in November and December. By January, we expect it to be fully covered, and then it will fully break up by kind of mid to late July every year. And at that point, every single bear who is in that area must be on land. When they are off the ice, when they are on land, they enter the summer fasting period as shown in the image here. And this really is our kind of a big first clue to how important this ice habitat is. We can just categorize this whole time in the summer as a summer fasting period. I get asked a lot when I'm guiding bear trips, like, don't the bears eat anything? Yeah, some bears might get lucky. Some bears might come across a washed up beluga whale carcass. Some bears might find a goose nest and eat some eggs. But overall, these bears are losing about 1 kilogram of weight per day as they are going through their fast. And unless you are a very lucky bear indeed, you are going to continue to lose that weight all the way through this fasting period and not start to put it back on until you get back on the ice again in the fall. The next ice region here is this divergent ice region. And this really marks the area along the coast of Alaska and then all of the coast of Russia here, including getting into far west Russia. So this ice here, it's still considered to be seasonal ice in that it does break up over the course of the springtime and through the summer, but there's still a component of it that remains through the summer. In this area, a lot of these bears actually reach their peak weights in the fall instead of in the spring, like our bears around Churchill do, simply because they've got the habitat to be on the ice longer. In this area, we have ice that's breaking up, and as that ice breaks up, not all of it's going to melt. A lot of it will continue to just move northwards with the overall patterns of water movements, the currents in the area. Decades ago, I'm told that you could often stand on the northern shoreline of Alaska and with a good pair of binoculars or a spotting scope, you would be able to see some of that offshore ice through the summer and be able to spot bears on the ice. Now, this is one of the areas that we're seeing ice breakdown earlier and earlier, and the ice is going further back, and some of those bears are now moving onto land for the summer months. But this is how the ice shifts here. It's not fully a melting, it's also a movement northwards of this ice. So these bears, like I said, they have a different annual pattern. They're spending more time on that ice, and their fat storage is happening at a different time of year as well. Our next ice zone is called this convergent ice zone. And this is where basically all that ice that's leaving the purple zone is getting pushed into. In the convergent ice zone, even though this is ice that does seasonally break up, you also have all this ice that's like moving into the area too. In this area, we see bears who often don't come on shore at all. So they will spend their full year or the majority of their year living on the ice and perhaps not even stepping foot on land throughout the entirety of the year. Now, even as the world has warmed, a lot of this area here within the convergent ice zone still has good polar bear habitat through the summer because of the ice that's continuing to move into the area from ice that's broken up elsewhere. So these bears are really, again, continuing to show us how important ice is, that given the choice, bears are just going to stay on the ice. They got nothing to do with land because the ice is there. And if the ice is there, there's no need to step foot on land. And then our last category here is the archipelago ice. So these are these narrow bodies of water between the Canadian Arctic archipelago islands. I love this picture. This is of like wind-blown ice in Kane Basin, which is a very shallow, narrow channel between Ellesmere Island and Greenland. This area here, we had previously seen a lot of summer sea ice through here, but we're starting to see a lot more breakup in the Arctic archipelago region. And if you've done any of the expedition cruises through the Northwest Passage, for example, a lot of these waters can now be accessed via icebreaker in the summer, and sometimes even by non-icebreaker vessels. So this is our fourth zone here, and our last zone is that Arctic Basin. Arctic Basin is a recognized population of bears. It's that white one that we had in the middle of the map. We know that there are occasional bears there. We actually have no estimates on how many, whether any bears are resident in the Arctic Basin or whether they're just traveling through. But we know that that ice remains year-round, and it's actually quite poor polar bear habitat because there's not very good productivity and because the ice is actually too thick for those bears. So we've talked about ice. I hope we're convinced now that if you're a polar bear, land is your second choice, and that not all ice is built the same way, and that each population of bears is dealing with a different ebb and flow of their ice cycle through the year. So just like we can't say all land habitat is the same, we can't say that all ice habitat is the same. And I know for me, like before I started getting into Arctic ecology, which was a long time ago now, if you'd asked me to picture Arctic ice, I probably would have pictured a big extent of frozen water that's very static. And that's simply not the case, right? It's got a little bit of topography to it, both above the water and below the water. It moves, it changes, there are openings, it's thicker or thinner in areas, you have different species that live in different areas. So while it may all look the same to our, uneducated eyes, it looks very, very different to the organisms that live in it. Now, when I'm talking about sea ice, there's a couple different definitions for this because I'm going to talk about open water as well as sea ice when we talk about these bear populations. When you read stats on like how sea ice might be decreasing in concentration and where the edge of open water is, when we're talking about this, like for ice ecology, we usually use 15% ice is open water. So if there's less than 15% of ice in the water, we just call that open water. But often with polar bears, we actually use 50% ice cover to mark the boundary of sea ice and no sea ice, because if there's less than 50% ice cover, bears probably won't be on it. It's just not enough ice for them. So when we're talking about the different kinds of sea ice, there might be a different definition depending on what we're actually talking about. So let's talk about how these bears are actually using this ice. I mentioned before that we do not have good bear data everywhere. Like, it is the exception when we have good data. We mostly don't have good data on where bears go. However, we do have some examples. This image here is from a study that was published around bears traveling, so satellite track bears that were traveling in the East Greenland population and where they moved during the year. So this was a study that was repeated in the 1990s and then in the 2000s with a very small number of bears. It was there was 4 bears being tracked for those red lines and 7 bears being tracked for the black lines, with the black ones being the most recent ones. So East Greenland, this is in our convergent ice zone. So we have ice that's being pushed here even through the summer as it breaks up in other areas. What we can see here with these bears is as they're going up and down and all along the coastline here, is that they're going up and down and all along the coastline offshore. These are all female bears, and you see that these circles right on the shoreline here, these are marked as, these are actually maternity dens. So this population of bears, the moms will go on shore to give birth. But every other time of the year and every other location besides when they're gestating and giving birth and nursing their newborn cubs, they are out on the ice. Now this ice, it's been noted that it is very dynamic, it moves a lot, and that in the winter, for example, the bears will go further offshore to access further away ice. And then in the summer, when both the ice is lesser and it moves more, they'll actually come closer to shore and use the ice as it pushes southwards to move them along the shoreline so they don't need to walk as much. So they were tracked as moving over 2,000 kilometers every year, these bears. And it's pretty cool to see that they're selecting ice, even as the ice changes from summer to winter. They're just using it differently because the ice itself, it's more static in the winter, it moves more in the summer. So they are changing how they are on the ice, depending on how much they want to move more or less. So the summer preference to be kind of moving less helps them choose where they want to be on the ice. So this is a population of bears who understands what's going on, right? Every single bear here is demonstrating that it knows how to use its environment at any point in the year to access the resources that it needs. Now, when I say track bears, this is kind of what it looks like. So this is a collared female bear I took a picture of a couple of years ago in Churchill. So you can see she's got a beautiful cub with her, of course. When we're talking about tracked bears, we have some data, like I'll talk about in a second, for male bears. But most of our satellite data comes from female bears. And this is simply because of the differences in sizes with male bears and female bears. Male bears are quite blocky. Their neck is bigger than their head. So you actually cannot put a satellite collar on a male bear. Female bears, they still have really big necks. And it's been quite easily demonstrated that a female bear who is intolerant of a collar, like she wants to get it off, the only thing that's actually holding it in place really is her ears. So if she pushes it off with her legs, it will pop right off. These satellite collars are designed to work about 2 years and to transmit locations, usually either once or twice a day during those 2 years. So we get great records of how these bears have moved around the ice during that time. Just so you know, there's an automatic release that's programmed into these satellite collars. And there's also a fail-safe in there, which is essentially a corrodable link. So there's 2 aluminum nuts that will corrode over the course of about a year or so and drop off just in case the automatic programmed release fails. So when we see a bear like this, we always know that she's tolerating it because she's chosen to keep it on, and it will be off within 1 to 2 years. However, there is some new stuff out there that's helping us track male bears and growing bears as well, because of course young cubs also can't have a collar put on them as they're growing. This is a new type of technology. This is an ear tag. It's a satellite ear tag that's deployed mainly on male bears and growing bears, so or subadult bears. And while it doesn't last quite as long, they can transmit for up to about 6 months as well. So we're getting great data now on location and habitat use from a bunch of bears. And these ear tags are being mostly used in our Western Hudson Bay and Southern Hudson Bay bears. So as we come back to our Western Hudson Bay bears and Southern Hudson Bay, remember this is the seasonal ice zone. So these bears have to cope with their habitat fully disappearing every year and then fully reforming. And these locations here were only taken 2 weeks apart. So if you look at this map, we have all of these like little blue and purple dots. These are all individual bears along the coastline here. And you can see in Hudson Bay that we have this white part starting along the coastline. The ice formation almost always starts on the western side and then crosses the water. And as soon as there is ice able to support a bear, those bears will move out onto the ice. And then 2 weeks later, look how much that ice formation has progressed and how those bears have just gone, whoop, there we go. And they just go out and spread out around the bay. So they will use that ice as soon as there is ice to be had. Now you might notice that there's a couple bears hanging out on land in these images here, and these will again be our denning females. So the only bears that are staying on land through the winter months are the ones who are giving birth. So this population of bears has been satellite tracked since the 1990s. It's neat to see, well, even though we're looking at a different type of ice, so this ice that forms and disappears every year, this is still such a productive area that bears are able to use this habitat, even though it's temporary, feed up, get nice and fat, and then they head back on land when they have to. The entirety of Hudson Bay is very shallow with an average depth of only about 300 or 400 feet and a max depth of just over 1,000 feet. So it's very, very productive habitat that's traditionally supported these bears really well. There are some cool tracking websites you can go to actually, this is publicly available information about where these bears are, and it gets uploaded regularly. So you can use both the Polar Bears International website to track specific bears. There's also a WWF Arctic species tracker that tracks more things besides just polar bears. And you can look at individual bears, or you can look at the entirety of all the tracked bears and see kind of where they are at any given time. So this is kind of obviously a very smooth map, but you can see where all of these bears have just kind of bounced around the ice for the last 8 months or so. And just for comparison, like these are winter movements here. I pulled up one bear and I asked it just for the locations for July, August, September, and October. And all it did was like, you know, walk a couple kilometers along the coastline of Hudson Bay. So just to show you that like when they're out on the ice, they're going woo all over the place, and bears might move 1,000 kilometers. They might go 2,000 kilometers during their winter treks. But when they are on land, there is simply no reason for them to go very far or very fast. And they just hunker down and wait for that habitat to come back, because land is not good polar bear habitat. Land is just what they use when there is no ice. So I love this picture. This is a view of the ice of Hudson Bay taken in January from an airplane window during landing. And you can see that, again, like I said, I'm guilty of thinking of the ice as one generic sheet of frozen water, but it's not. It's differently. Look at this ice. There's ridges, there's openings. You can tell that this ice is moving around. So this ice will always have some openings here and there. While we say that Hudson Bay is fully ice covered or anywhere else, there's always movement. There's always little cracks and openings that appear. This ice can be about 3 feet thick at its when it's as thick as it gets in the winter. And those areas where those little chunks of ice ran together can be about twice that thick, with the pressure ridges going both up and down being about 6 feet thick. So it is a very, very dynamic environment. In Hudson Bay, for example, we also have currents, so that ice is always flowing in a counterclockwise direction, just like our ice is flowing in our more northerly basins as well. And you as a bear have to get out there, and you're excited to get out there. You're excited to be back in your preferred habitat. You've got to navigate. You've got to find yourself some food. And that's your place to be. Just another picture here of the ice of Hudson Bay. And you can see how dynamic it is and how there's often this little open lead along the edge of the water here, because that ice is moving in that counterclockwise direction, and you can just see it shifting all around, causing multiple open leads that are, they open, they close, very, very dynamic. So the ice cover is full, but not continuous. The areas where ice is not continuous is very important for our polar bears, because this is where they're going to be interacting with their prey species. And if you're a bear, what are you depending on? Well, you are depending, believe it or not, on that ice to support all your nutritional needs. And again, I think this is why it's so hard for us as humans, because we look at, right, you look at this, let me go back. You look at this and you say, excuse me, where's the forest? Where are the trees? Like, where's the stuff that the insects are eating, that the birds are eating? Like, where's our food web? There's nothing there to support it. It's a great big expanse of ice. But there are species out there that have had all these millennia to adapt to living in and on and around the sea ice, and that is what they have done. So we have a whole sea ice food web ecosystem that relies on phytoplankton, so algae that actually live within the ice. These are our single-celled plant-like organisms that grow within salty channels within the ice. And while it may not be a forest, those algae, those single-celled plant-like organisms, support the entirety of this food web. They're able to grow in such numbers and in such weight that they support the phytoplankton, they support the zooplankton, they support things like the cod, the seals, the narwhals, the bowhead whales, the polar bears. It all comes from a basis of algae within the ice. And this is certainly not my image, but this is a picture here of krill grazing on algae growing within the ice. So it was a remote vehicle underneath the sea ice showing you that even though we can't see it from above and it looks like this bland ecosystem, there's life happening down there, and it's busy, and plants are growing, and things are feeding on the plants, and then other things are feeding on the things that are feeding on the plants. So it's busy down there, even though we're not seeing it. What polar bears are looking for out of this food web is mostly going to be, here you can see a little arrow here going up to our bear, it's mostly going to be seals. And of all our species of seals that polar bears eat, it's mostly going to be ring seals. It's not the only thing bears eat, but it's the thing that they most frequently eat. They're smallish seals, so they're about human size, about 110 to 150 pounds. Population estimates are that there's probably around a couple million of them, with about 5 different subspecies. These guys are fish eaters, so they're eating things like capelin and Arctic cod, sand lance, sculpin, smelt. The Arctic food web is not very diverse, so if you hear these words, you're like, oh, I've heard of these fish before. Yeah, they feed everything up there. If you've ever seen a puffin, or if you've seen an ivory gull, they're eating the same things that these seals are. They're just probably not being eaten by a polar bear in return. So these fish feed everything within the Arctic food web, including the seals, and then the seals, unfortunately for them, end up feeding the polar bear. Found, unsurprisingly, exactly where you find polar bears. So polar bears put themselves where the seals are. Now, seals are marine mammals. They spend their lives in the water, and they don't exit for a whole lot of reasons. They exit to breathe, so they have to come up to breathe about let's say on average, about every 15 minutes or so. They sleep underwater, and they sleep by taking very short rests and then coming up to breathe. They come onto the top of the ice, essentially to mate, to give birth, and to molt. And that's about it. So if you're a bear and this is your primary food source, the time that you overlap with a seal is quite limited. And it often looks like this. So this here is a polar bear on the ice in the winter doing something that we call still hunting. So still hunting is kind of what it sounds like. It's a bear that parks itself beside a ring seal breathing hole, and it sits or it lays or it stands, and it stays very still and it waits. Each of these ring seals will maintain anywhere between 5 and 15 breathing holes during the course of the winter. They actually have a very sharp set of claws in their front flippers to scrape away at the ice because they have to be able to always get to air, right? And ring seals coming up to breathe and polar bears looking for those seals is really one of their only times that they're going to overlap and where and when they are. Now, still hunting can be very successful. Estimates range from about 20% of hunts being successful down to more around 5% of hunts being successful. But if you're a lucky polar bear, what you're going to see is a picture or an image something like this. So a seal coming up, and remember that ice is 3 to 6 feet thick. So once they're kind of in, they're not fully committed, but those breathing holes are pretty narrow. So this is the time when a polar bear is going to be very still. And right before a seal comes up to the top, there's going to be a little push of water that the seal has moved, with its body, and that is a time for a polar bear to strike. It's difficult for a seal to wiggle its way back down. They can do it, but this is when a polar bear is hoping to get lucky. Now, this is a picture from a well-known polar bear researcher up here in Canada named Andrew DeRoche. He took this picture, I think, just this past winter, and it was of a failed still hunt. And you can see the tail written here, right? We have polar bear tracks coming to the breathing hole, polar bear tracks going away from the breathing hole, no blood on the snow and no carcass left behind, therefore unsuccessful. It's usually quite dramatically obvious when it has been a successful hunt because blood shows up very, very well on that snow. So this is a bear who's come, who checked it out, and who was either unsuccessful or who decided it wasn't worth waiting for. And they might decide that just based on how recently it smells like this breathing hole has been used. Now, breathing holes are not the only time that polar bears might be getting access to seals. They're also going to be waiting for the springtime, so not quite yet, but getting into, say, March, April, when those ring seals are going to have their pups. They actually will make an under the snow but over the ice den to give birth to their pup. And of these seal pups that are born inside these dens, we estimate that at least 50%, perhaps, about 50% of these seals might just meet their end more or less immediately via polar bear. Now, for our populations of bears living in the seasonal sea ice zone, this time when you've got a population of kind of stuck and kind of stupid babies that you can eat is when they're obtaining the majority of their calories. So they are putting on as much weight as they can in these months where there are seal pups and when they are, able to get access to these calories. Our populations of bears who have a different ebb and flow to their cycle and who have access to ice going into the summer months, they're actually going to, like I said, continue to put on weight into the summer. Our bears who have seasonal sea ice and their habitat disappears, they've got to make hay while the sun shines and eat as many of these seal pups as they can. And it can look something like this. So this is a female bear here who's got her head into a birth layer. In this case, she's being watched by a male who's interested in perhaps making more bears with her, which also happens in the springtime. But they're out here not just looking for love, but primarily looking for food as well. So their sense of smell is incredible. It helps them find the birth layer. And while this last picture here made it look really obvious and easy, the next picture makes it look more like it actually is, just more snow, just more ice. And the only way that polar bears are able to get these relatively easy meals is by using their tremendous sense of smell to find those birthing layer locations. And then they'll actually rear up, punch down through the roof of the birthing layer, and hopefully come up with a baby seal. And if they get really lucky, they catch mom in their nursing too. And that's really what they're hoping for, is the adult seal as well as the pup. Now, these aren't the only ways that they hunt on the ice. I mentioned that bears stay on ice about until there's about 50% cover. And if you're trying to picture like behavior like this, the still hunting and this birth layer punching when there's a lot more water than ice, it's harder to picture, right? Because we don't have that same intersection of habitats at that single point. So if you're a bear and you've got flows of ice, but also lots of water around you, can you still hunt? You sure can. It just takes a bit more work. So this is active stalking type of hunting. And this happens when bears are able to either swim up to a seal or approach it over the ice. So this is very active. They're trying to get as close to the seal as possible before they basically sprint towards it and hopefully dispatch it before it's able to get away. But this is what hunting can look like when you've got flows of ice with water all around. This is a seal basking in the sun, likely going through its molt. So what seals will molt annually in the springtime, they come out onto the ice, they sit in that beautiful spring weather, and they will actually molt last year's fur. That's a great time for a bear to try to catch these seals when they're resting and when they might not have as easy access to water. So bear will kind of crawl towards. It kind of looks like watching a border collie go after sheep, right? They crawl, they pause if they think they're being looked at, crawl further, and not until they get like quite close to the seal do they use that explosive speed that they have to pounce on their prey. So even as that ice habitat shifts seasonally, they're still able to use it to hunt. And yum yum, seals are what they want, and seals are usually what they get. An adult bear in good condition will actually peel the skin off and just eat the fat from the animal, leaving most of the meat behind. A subadult bear or an adult who might need more calories may actually consume the entire seal. When there's bits left behind, usually Arctic foxes or other scavenger animals will come and do the cleanup. And it is incredibly high in calories. So 100 grams of seal blubber gives you 819 calories, 100 grams being, half a cup's worth approximately. And you've got a lot of seal there in front of you. So your average polar bear needs about 12,000 calories just to get through a normal day. So they're able to put this weight onto their body and store it to be able to draw off of it when the ice is not in great shape. Ring seals are not the only things that they eat. They also will hunt or scavenge belugas, narwhals, walrus, bearded seals, harp seals, hooded seals. If it's a marine mammal with blubber and they're able to catch it, they will probably try. Now, while these bears are hunting on the ice, temperatures might be, above the freezing mark. It might be 5 degrees Celsius, so, 40 Fahrenheit, or it could be down to negative 50 Celsius, which could be around negative 60 Fahrenheit. In terms of how they make that work, well, it's more like if you're wondering how a bear makes it work, when they struggle is in the heat. It's not in the cold. When we come to Churchill to see bears and we see you might be outside and it's negative 20 and it feels like negative 40 because the wind is howling and you just see this bear curled up in the snow and then it wakes up and it shakes off the snow and it stretches and you're like, that bear looks very comfortable right now, right? They look uncomfortable in the heat. They look very comfortable in the cold. So they have a whole host of adaptations that let them thrive in these conditions. And this ranges from the double layer of coat of fur that they have that helps prevent almost all heat loss. And it's so well insulative that when they run, their running length of time is more defined by how quickly they overheat than by when they get tired. So they have to slow down or stop as they run simply to dissipate heat, as opposed to just getting tired. So very, very thick fur. And the fat storage helps as well. So one of the ways to survive when you don't have access to ice is by storing fat. But this layer of fat also works to keep them warm. It doesn't always work as intended, because if you're a bear on seasonal sea ice, you might end up really fat through the summer and be a little uncomfortable. But their fat layer can be about 4 to 5 inches thick on their body. Now, when they're swimming, and polar bears do a lot of swimming, they rely on their fat more so than their fur to keep out the cold, which is why if you're ever lucky enough to see a polar bear with cubs, you'll notice that they very much try to avoid going in the water. Cubs don't have enough fat to stay warm yet until they start to put this layer on. So when we're looking at bears, when we're visualizing them and seeing them on a tour, we're trying to scale, are they in good condition? Are they an average bear? Are they a fat bear? Are they a very fat bear? With, fat and very fat being really nice looking bears in really good shape. And collectively, this fat and this fur means that their insulative value is incredible, right? If you were to look at a polar bear with an infrared scanner, and that bear closed its eyes and closed its mouth and held its breath, you would likely not even be able to pick up that bear with using the infrared camera. So it's really just their breath, their mouth, and a little bit around their armpits and their groin that dissipates the heat when they actually get too hot. Those feet are really specialized for moving around the ice, both in terms of their size. So they can be up to about 30 centimeters or 12 inches across, which helps spread their weight around. It also provides a nice stable platform for moving across a potentially slippery surface. And they walk a lot, right? I mentioned that there are some bears that might travel a couple thousand kilometers in a year, right? A bear might travel easily 50 miles in a day. And that's just on these big old feet. So in addition to walking, they're able to swim with these big paws. And this image here on the right shows us the texture of those paws at very, very high magnification. So much like our anti-slip footwear, there's a lot of teeny tiny ridges and valleys within these feet that helps them grip even on a slippery surface. And these guys, they're more evolved for movements across a cold slippery surface than a warm slippery surface. We know, We know that there's a pile of other adaptations that helps them move well on the ice as well, and helps them live on the ice. And a really nice one that we often call out when we're looking at bears is they're most closely related to brown bears, but when you compare the head shape of a polar bear to the head shape of a brown bear, you go, I can tell they're both bears, but they sure look different. And if you picture having to shove your head and neck into a seal's breathing hole and be able to pull it out without getting stuck, you want that lovely streamlined shape that a polar bear has as opposed to what a brown bear has. So every part of them is adapted for that life on the ice, and all of them would rather be on the ice than on land. All these things together give us nature's most perfect form. This is a female who has come off the ice as the ice broke up in July one year. This is not my image, but I saw this bear. She was large, she was in charge, and this is what looks like nothing to us produces on a bear in a good year. What looks like an unbroken sheet of white nothingness, somehow, through all of these wonderful miracles of photosynthesis and our Arctic food web, makes us able to see bears that can pull calories from what seems like thin air, but they are really just living their best life on the ice and doing so very well while moving through this habitat. So when we think about bears on the ice, don't think about them on this bland, flat surface. Think about an ice that moves. Think about habitat that's different. Think about habitat where you've got different levels of productivity. And you can think about a happy bear sleeping next to a half-eaten seal, if you like. And it's probably happening out there right now. So I'll hand things back over to Rob for questions right now. And thanks, Rob.
All right. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Now, before we dive into the questions, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. All right, so let's dive into some of these questions. So you mentioned that a seal will molt. Can you molt? I'm sorry. Can you explain what that means?
Oh, molting is analogous to shedding, right? So if you think about a husky or a dog who come the springtime, all of a sudden it feels like there's dog seeds blowing in the wind everywhere because all of that undercoat, their insulative coat, is dropping in preparation to make a new, better one for next year. That's what those seals are doing. So seal coats, just like every marine mammal and other mammals like your dogs, they depend on their hair to be in good shape. They want it to be the right length. It's got to have a nice oil covering on it. And that hair breaks down over the course of a year, right? It gets damaged. It just takes wear and tear. And so in the springtime, when they've got relative warmth and they're not nursing anybody and no obligations. they've got this opportunity to just lay on the ice and they just lose all that fur kind of in a very short period of time. And it then gets replaced by what they're going to use for the next year, which is in better shape, better able to keep them warm, better able to, protect their heat loss.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you so much for explaining that, just in case we didn't know. While inland near Churchill, do polar bears eat any other animals like non-blubbery animals, or do they eat fruits and berries, anything like that?
Yeah, so I think the thing that is that I will always find endlessly fascinating about bears is, we can talk in generalities, but every bear has its own strategy. Every bear has learned a different way. Every bear has explored and figured something else out. You're going to see bears who you could probably put a bushel of berries in front of them and they go like, no, not interested. And then you see bears who have clearly found a good berry patch because, their entire backside is blue from sitting and squashing crowberries and whatever's coming out the back end. So every bear is going to be a little different. Yes, some bears will eat berries. Some bears will do things like eat geese. So we have a big population of both Canada geese and snow geese who nest in the relatively immediate area. And when geese are nesting, and they're responsible for their goslings, that's actually when geese molt. So they will lose their last year's damaged feathers and regrow new ones, but during that time they can't fly, which is fine because then they probably fly away from their babies. But this is also when, if you're a polar bear, you stand a chance of, catching and eating a goose. What we do know, though, is when we talk about the nutritional value of a ring seal versus the nutritional value of blueberries or a goose egg, they simply don't compare. For a bear to have a caloric need of around 12,000 calories a day, you're not getting that from eggs and you're not getting that from blueberries. So even if they're finding those sources of food that are not based on marine fat, they're still losing pretty much all the weight they otherwise would. The bears that we see not lose weight over the course of the summer are like the bears who come across a washed up bowhead whale, who find, there's always death in the animal kingdom, so you get washed up animals sometimes. I did once see a polar bear hunt and kill a very stupid seal in the open water in a way that I never thought a polar bear would be able to do, but it did. So some bears get lucky, but most bears in those seasonal ice zones will lose weight through the course of that fasting period.
Gotcha. Thank you. You mentioned that foxes scavenge polar bear kills. How far will they travel out onto the sea ice, and can they swim?
Oh, Arctic foxes are incredible. I actually did a whole webinar on Arctic foxes because they are so wild. Arctic foxes will travel across the sea ice with as much comfort as polar bears travel across the sea ice. Arctic foxes are reliant on either, food like lemmings and small rodents. things like goose eggs, or they have a whole different life strategy where sometimes they'll just leave land behind to go follow the polar bears for a winter. And usually when the rodent population isn't doing well or they weren't able to cache a bunch of food in the summer, they'll just go out and they'll follow polar bears. And we have, for example, a satellite tracked Arctic fox collar that tracked one female Arctic fox that went from the coast of northern Norway up and across the ice and ended up over the course of about 6 weeks midway down the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and just like no big deal, apparently crossed half of the Arctic basin in about 6 weeks. So while we don't have a bunch of collars out there to say how much each fox, how far they each go, we see that they are absolutely capable of very long distance travel on the ice.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Are there any walruses in the area? And is that something that a polar bear would try to kill, or is that a tough battle?
It is a very tough battle. So, do polar bears ever take a walrus? Yes, but it is, if you go onto YouTube or whatever and look for polar bears and walrus, you can see videos of polar bears just walking through a colony of walrus, and the walrus are like, whatever. And they're not even usually concerned, especially those big males, which might be 2 or 3 times the size of a polar bear in terms of weight. And their skin is hugely thick. You can also see videos of like a polar bear trying to tear into a walrus, and it just can't even get a grip on it. So being successful at hunting a walrus takes a lot of skills, and it doesn't happen every time. So usually we only see successful hunts when it's a male, like a big male polar bear. And usually if he's managed to do something like panic a bunch of juveniles and they decide to stampede, and one young walrus might get crushed in the stampede. Otherwise, walruses they're not quite home free from polar bears, but they're pretty darn close. We don't have walruses in the Churchill area, but we do have bearded seals. Bearded seals kind of fill a similar ecological niche to walruses, and we see them usually in different spots. Bearded seals are quite large. They're much larger than a ringed seal, so they also make a really good meal for a polar bear if they get their hands on them.
So are you familiar with reports of polar bears in Alaska adapting to the land and interbreeding with other types of bears as the ice cover decreases? Is this a symptom of global warming? And is that something that happens in Churchill as well?
Yeah, so in the Churchill area, we actually don't just have polar bears. We also have black bears and we have brown bears. Specifically, we have what's called a barren ground grizzly bear, which are an inland grizzly, which are reportedly quite mean. I've never encountered one on the ground myself. I'm less familiar with information out of Alaska, but I can certainly speak to stuff that we know of in Canada and the research that we've encountered in here. So we do know of hybridizations that have happened between polar bears and grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are just a subspecies of brown bear that's found in land. And those bears, we find them in the wild. I should say, like most of what we know of these hybrids come from zoos, because often polar bears and brown bears, or like polar bears and spectacled bears, bears get stored together, and all of the bears within the Ursus genus can hybridize. Polar bears and grizzly bears, we know that they can hybridize. We also know they can produce a fertile hybrid, and those hybrids can go on to have more babies. At this point in Canada, we know of just a handful of hybrids. And recently, I think it was just last winter, a study was completed that looked at the genetic testing of those hybrids, because they were all pretty well found in a certain small location. And it turned out that every single one of those hybrids was either one coming from one mom, or it came from her daughter. So it was like a very distinct single, like I guess it was multiple events, but it was like one single bear and then her offspring that was choosing to hybridize. And we haven't seen any other documented cases of hybridization in the wild in Canada. You sometimes see reports that, ooh, I think I saw a hybrid bear. This one might be a hybrid. And what it almost always turns out is a dirty polar bear. Dirty polar, like that white fur gets dirty really easily and they pick up a lot of tones to them. And they can look like a half brown bear pretty quickly. But once they go for a swim and clean themselves off, they're pretty obviously a polar bear.
Great. Thank you, Eleanor. Unfortunately, I know we could talk about this all day, but that is going to be the last question that we do have time for. So I'm going to hand it back to you for some closing comments.
Thanks, Robin. I know we could talk about these all day, and I know on our polar bear trips, we actually spent days and days and days talking about polar bears, but thanks everybody for coming and learning more about the world of ice and about what those polar bears are doing out there, and I hope to see you in Churchill someday.
Eleanor, thanks for taking the time to present this for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel up to Churchill and visit Eleanor, give us a call at NatHab at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on the website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.